It began on a cold morning when the wind carried the kind of silence that made the world feel empty. The kind of silence that comes before something is destroyed, and Daniel Reed felt it in his bones long before he saw the dust rising at the end of the road. He stood on the porch of the only home he had ever known, a small wooden house built by his father's hands, a place filled with his mother's laughter, a place where every corner carried a memory. And he watched with tired eyes as a long line of HOA trucks rolled forward like an army coming for war, their engines growling, their bright yellow lights flashing, their tires crushing the gravel like they were crushing history itself, and Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. He only watched as men in shiny jackets jumped out and began hammering bright red notices on every fence post, every wooden beam, every gate, the loud thud echoing across the empty fields, as if someone was hitting the heart of the land. And Daniel's chest tightened because he knew these fields like he knew his own heartbeat. He knew the smell of the morning soil, the sound of the old barn door creaking, the whisper of wheat dancing in the wind. Yet these strangers walked with confidence, walked with ownership, walked as if his life meant nothing at all. One man stepped forward with a clipboard, his voice sharp and cold as he looked at Daniel and said the words that cut deeper than any knife. "Your property has been reported as abandoned, unsafe, and non-compliant. You are ordered to vacate immediately." And Daniel stared at him, feeling the world tilt under his feet, because how could anyone call his home abandoned when his hands had touched every inch of it since childhood? How could they call it unsafe when his father rebuilt the roof with care? How could they call it non-compliant when Daniel had lived here for 40 years without a single complaint from anyone? But the man didn't wait for questions, didn't give space for emotion, didn't acknowledge Daniel's shaking hands. He simply stepped aside and let a team of workers march through the property like they were inspecting trash, pointing, laughing, shaking their heads, making jokes about the old porch, the broken swing, the rusted tractor that had served 3 generations of Reed men. And Daniel felt heat rise in his face, but he stayed silent, trying to understand what was happening, trying to breathe while the ground beneath him felt stolen piece by piece. And the wind stung his eyes, but he didn't wipe the tears. Maybe they were from the cold. Maybe from the sight of strangers labeling his entire life as worthless. One worker ripped down the welcome sign his mother painted when he was 10. Another kicked the barn door open without respect. Another pried open a wooden crate filled with his father's old tools. The same tools that built half the town. Tools that held stories, sweat, and love, but to them it was junk, disposable, meaningless. And Daniel's fingers curled into fists, but he didn't step forward, because deep inside he knew if he shouted now, if he fought now, they would twist his anger into an excuse to take even more, to arrest him, to humiliate him, to finish the job faster, and he couldn't give them that satisfaction. So he stood there with quiet dignity as the head of the HO, a tall woman with a polished smile, Patricia Whitmore, known to everyone as a powerful Karen, walked through his yard like she owned the place, her expensive heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt, her cold eyes scanning everything with a judge's cruelty. And she gave Daniel a smirk that carried pure arrogance as she said, "This land will be better once we clean it up. We're building a luxury community here, Grand Oaks. You should be grateful we're improving the area." And those words burned deeper than fire, because this land didn't need improvement, it needed respect, it needed memory, it needed the love it had always carried. But she didn't see that, she didn't want to see it. She only saw profit, numbers, and power. And Daniel looked at her but didn't answer, because anything he said would drown in her pride. So he simply watched as she waved her hand, giving the workers the order to begin demolition preparations, and everything after that felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. They placed orange markers around the barn, red flags near the old oak tree he planted with his father, yellow tape across the porch where his mother used to sit every evening watching the sunset, and Daniel felt his heart breaking in real time because they were marking memories for death. Not buildings, not spaces, but memories, pieces of his soul. And he wanted to scream, but the sound stayed trapped in his throat, crushed under years of hardship, silence, and loss. And when the sun began to sink into the horizon, the cold became sharper, the workers grew louder, and Daniel remained seated on the porch steps, staring at the home that no longer felt like his, watching them tear down bits of the barn, watching them drag broken wood across the yard, listening to them laugh as if they were tearing apart cardboard and not someone's life, their jokes slicing through the air. Man, this place is ancient. How did anyone even live here? Good thing the HOA is saving the neighborhood. And every word was a bullet hitting Daniel's chest. But he didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble. He just inhaled the cold air deeply, letting it numb the ache, letting the darkness hide his grief. And as the final piece of sunset disappeared behind the hills, a strong gust of wind swept through the property, lifting dust and dry leaves into the air. And something inside Daniel finally broke. Not in anger, not in defeat, but in clarity, because he realized something. The land was being destroyed, yes, but he was still alive. He still had his mind, his memory, his truth, and truth was stronger than their bulldozers, stronger than their fake laws, stronger than their arrogance. And as he sat there, alone on the steps of his empty porch, cold wind on his face, loneliness wrapping around him like a heavy blanket, he whispered one quiet promise to the land they stole, a promise so soft that even he barely heard it, a promise that carried pain, love, and a fire he didn't know he still had inside him. A promise only the wind understood. I'm not done. And in that moment something shifted, a spark lit in the darkness, a seed planted deep in the soil of revenge and justice. And though the HOA believed they had won, believed they had crushed him completely, they didn't see the way his eyes changed, didn't see the strength returning to his shoulders, didn't see that Daniel Reed, the quiet man they treated like nothing, was slowly turning into the storm they never expected. A storm that would break their pride and shake their empire from the inside. But that was for later. For now he watched the trucks leave, watched the dust settle, watched the night swallow his home. And when he finally stood up, the land behind him felt wounded but not defeated. And neither was he, because Daniel Reed might have lost his home, his fields, and his memories. But he had not lost himself, and the silence of that night carried one truth. The HOA had taken everything, but they had no idea what they had awakened. Daniel left his land that night without a sound, walking down the empty road with nothing but a small bag and a heart that felt heavier than the cold air around him. He didn't look back because the sight of strangers tearing down his father's barn would have broken him again. So he kept walking until the house disappeared behind the darkness, and when he reached the small cabin he rented outside town, he stepped inside slowly, the wooden floor creaking under his worn boots, the room cold and unfamiliar, a single dim lamp flickering like it was scared to be alive. And Daniel sat on the edge of the small bed, breathing slow, trying to calm the storm inside him. But no matter how much he tried, he could still hear the voices of the HOA workers laughing, still hear Patricia's cruel tone saying, "Your land will look better once we clean it," and every word echoed like a hammer, hitting the same bruise again and again. But Daniel didn't cry, didn't break. Instead he felt something growing inside him, quiet but strong, like the roots of an old oak tree pushing deeper into the earth. And he knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be, because his family didn't build that land with blood and sweat just for some shiny jacket strangers to take it away with a smile. The next morning Daniel woke up before sunrise, the cabin still cold, the world still quiet, and he sat beside the small window watching the sky turn pale blue, everything inside him tired but alive, and he whispered softly, "I'll get it back," as if reminding himself that the story wasn't finished. And after a few minutes he stood up, washed his face with cold water, put on his old jacket, and walked to town with slow, steady steps. He avoided people, avoided questions, avoided pity, because he didn't want anyone to ask why he wasn't on his land. He didn't want anyone to see the hurt on his face. He wanted silence, only silence, because silence gave him space to think, to plan, to breathe, and Daniel knew that silence was his greatest strength. The HOA was loud, flashy, arrogant, but he was quiet, patient, and patience built stronger walls than any luxury neighborhood ever could. He reached the public library, a place he hadn't visited since childhood, a place where his mother used to take him on rainy days, and stepping inside felt like stepping back into a safe moment. The smell of old books wrapping around him like a warm blanket, and he walked straight to the archives section. His footsteps slow but determined, because today he wasn't Daniel the farmer, he was Daniel the investigator, the man with nothing left to lose. And men with nothing to lose were dangerous. Even if they didn't shout or fight, they were dangerous because their mind became sharp, focused, fearless, and Daniel's mind began working like a machine built from pain and purpose. He pulled out old land records, dusty folders, yellowing maps, documents with fading ink, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned page after page, searching for something, maybe a mistake, maybe a hidden truth, maybe a crack in the HOA's claim, and he found many things, small things, confusing things, strange things, records that didn't match, signatures that looked copied, dates that made no sense, and slowly the picture became clearer. This wasn't just a simple eviction. This was a planned takeover, a greedy plan built on lies, and the more Daniel read, the stronger his heart beat, because anger was rising but not the wild kind. It was the quiet kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that sits deep in a person's chest and waits, and Daniel let it sit, let it grow, let it become fuel for what he was about to do. Days passed, and every day he returned to the library, sometimes morning, sometimes evening, sometimes until closing time. Nobody asked questions because Daniel moved like a shadow, slipping in and out without a sound. And in those nights when the cabin felt too small, when memories felt too heavy, he would walk outside under the moonlight, hands in his pockets, boots crunching on the frost, eyes staring at the distant glow of the Grand Oaks construction site. He could see the bright lights, the tall machines, the new streets taking shape, the homes rising from his land, and each time he saw it, it cut him deeper. But it also sharpened his resolve, because every brick they placed was another reminder of what they tried to steal, and Daniel kept whispering to himself, "Keep building, keep going. I'll take everything back when the time is right." And the wind always seemed to answer with a soft rustle, as if the land itself was agreeing. When Daniel wasn't in the library, he worked small jobs around town, fixing fences, repairing roofs, carrying heavy crates for shopkeepers who couldn't do it themselves. People always thanked him, offered him warm meals, asked how he was doing, but Daniel always smiled softly and said, "I'm all right," even though he wasn't, because he didn't want anyone to carry his burden. He didn't want sympathy, he wanted justice, and justice didn't grow from telling sad stories. Justice grew from quiet effort, from secrets gathered piece by piece, from truth strong enough to stand in court. And that became Daniel's new life. Working by day, gathering evidence by night, sleeping little but thinking much. One evening, when the sky was painted orange and pink, Daniel passed by the new neighborhood again, staying far enough to avoid being noticed, and from the hill he saw something that made his jaw tighten. The HOA had placed a giant sign at the entrance. "Welcome to Grand Oaks Luxury Community." Shiny letters, clean stone pillars, flowers planted neatly around it, all sitting on land that once carried his family name. And then he saw her, Patricia Whitmore, standing proudly near the sign, giving a tour to potential buyers, walking with her chin high, laughing loudly, pointing at the homes like she was presenting a kingdom, and Daniel felt a cold wave wash over him, not fear, not sadness, but something harder, something sharper, because he knew people like Patricia. He knew her kind of confidence, the kind that believed money could erase history, the kind that thought small-town families were obstacles to profit, the kind that walked through life stepping on others without ever looking down. And Daniel whispered softly into the wind, "Your time is coming." And even though Patricia couldn't hear him, something in the air changed, as if the land itself was listening. That night Daniel sat at his small wooden table in the cabin, candlelight flickering across stacks of papers spread in front of him. The room quiet except for the soft scratch of his pencil on a notepad as he copied dates, names, signatures, small details that others would ignore. But Daniel didn't ignore anything. He collected every stray piece of information like a farmer collecting seeds, because he knew one day these seeds would grow into something powerful, something strong enough to take down the entire HOA board. And when he finished writing, he leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. But even through exhaustion he felt something new, hope. A tiny spark but real, alive, warm, and Daniel let himself breathe deeply, feeling that hope settle inside him like a preparing storm. In the coming days he visited the courthouse quietly, spoke to clerks politely, requested old property records with steady hands, and every time a new document landed on the table in front of him, he studied it as if it was the most important thing in the world, because to him it was a map leading to truth, and each line he read, each signature he compared, Each law he researched brought him closer to understanding the depth of the HOA's crime, and with every discovery his silent plan grew stronger, clearer, sharper, and Daniel realized something important. He didn't need anger, didn't need revenge through violence, he needed patience, law, timing, and truth, and he was gathering all four. Still, even with his growing strength, nights were hard, nights brought memories he couldn't push away, memories of his mother singing while hanging clothes on the line, of his father sharpening tools in the barn, of warm summer evenings with fireflies glowing near the fields. And sometimes the weight of those memories became too heavy, and he would sit on the cabin floor with his back against the wall, eyes closed tightly, breathing slowly to keep himself together. But even through the pain, he never gave up, never doubted himself, because he knew his family would not want him to break. They would want him to rise, and rise he would. And every night before he slept, he repeated the same words like a prayer or a promise. "I'm not done, not yet." And the silence around him felt like a witness, holding his promise gently, waiting for the day he would return not as the broken farmer they pushed away but as the man who would take everything back. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel's silence became sharper than any weapon. He moved like a shadow through town, collecting pieces of truth the way his father once collected seeds. Before planting season, carefully, quietly, patiently, and even though the HOA believed he was gone forever, believed he had accepted defeat, believed he was too old and too tired to fight, Daniel was slowly building something far more powerful than anger. He was building a case, a truth so solid it could break mountains, a truth the HOA never expected him to find because they thought people like him didn't know how to look, didn't know where to search, didn't know how to fight back. But they were wrong, deadly wrong. One cold afternoon, as Daniel flipped through dusty files in the courthouse archive room, the old lights above him flickered every few minutes, making the room feel like a forgotten world buried under years of paper and secrets. He pulled out a worn binder marked Historical Land Transfers, 1950 to 1975. The leather cover cracked, the pages yellow and brittle, and he turned each page with trembling fingers because he felt something in his chest. A pull, a whisper, a strange feeling that he was getting close to something important, something buried deep, something the HOA overlooked. And when his eyes scanned across a faded handwritten document tucked between two unrelated files, his breath caught in his throat. The paper was old, browned at the edges, the ink faint but still readable, and on the top it said simply, "Reed Family Land Agreement, 1961. Daniel's heart began to race, pounding so loudly he could hear it echo in the small room. His fingers tightened on the fragile document as he lifted it slowly, carefully, like he was lifting a piece of his father's soul, and tears filled his eyes before he could stop them because he recognized the handwriting instantly. He had seen it in old letters, in notes left on the kitchen table, in messages pinned to the barn wall. It was his grandfather's handwriting, strong and uneven, written by a man who worked the land with calloused hands and a proud heart. Daniel sat down on the nearest chair, the room spinning slightly as he stared at the words, reading them again and again until their meaning hit him like a bolt of lightning. The agreement clearly stated that the Reed land could never be sold, transferred, or claimed by anyone without a direct signature from a living Reed family member, and the signature of his grandfather at the bottom proved it was legally binding. There was no loophole, no expiry date, no hidden condition. It was simple and powerful. The HOA had no right to take his land, no right to build on it, no right to touch even a single grain of its soil, and as Daniel read the words again, his hands began to shake, not from fear, not from sadness, but from a burning fire in his chest, a fire made of pride and justice and long-hidden strength. His mind raced as he imagined the moment the HOA signed their fake papers, imagining Patricia Whitmore sitting in her office with that arrogant smile, thinking she was untouchable, thinking Daniel was helpless, thinking the Reed family name meant nothing anymore. But she had no idea that a single forgotten paper buried in an old courthouse box was about to destroy everything she built. She had no idea that her pride was built on stolen land, and the land itself had been waiting quietly for the right person to reclaim it, and that person was sitting right here, holding proof that could turn her entire kingdom to dust. Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, steadying his breathing as he placed the document on the table, smoothing its fragile edges. And in that moment he felt something inside him shift deeply, like a locked door opening after years in darkness. Because this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was justice written in ink, signed by his bloodline, protected by law stronger than anything the HOA forged, and for the first time since losing his land, Daniel felt power in his hands. Real power, quiet but unstoppable, and he whispered softly to the empty room, "Grandpa, you didn't let them take it." And the words trembled with emotion, gratitude, and a strength he thought he had lost. He sat there for a long time, staring at the document as if afraid it would disappear, afraid it was only a dream. But the paper remained real, solid, unbroken by time, and after a while Daniel folded it carefully, slid it into a protective sleeve he bought earlier just in case, and placed it inside his old leather bag, the same bag his father once used to carry important tools, and the weight of the document felt like carrying his entire family on his shoulders, a weight heavy with responsibility but strong with purpose. When he stepped outside the courthouse, the winter sun was low, the cold wind brushing his face gently like a hand guiding him forward, and Daniel stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, watching the world continue around him without knowing that something huge had changed, something that would shake the ground under the HOA's feet, something that would turn Grand Oaks into a mistake the whole town would talk about for decades. And as he walked down the steps slowly, he didn't feel tired anymore, didn't feel defeated, didn't feel alone. He felt like a man rising from ashes, silent but unstoppable. That night he didn't sleep. He sat at his small table, the candlelight glowing softly as he read the document over and over, each word becoming a promise to his parents, to his grandparents, to the land itself. And with every reading he felt more alive, more determined, more certain of what he had to do. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It was patience learning how to breathe, and Daniel realized something very important. Revenge wasn't about shouting, fighting, or burning everything down. True revenge was giving your enemy the rope they happily tied around their own neck, and the HOA had already done that. He just needed to pull. In the morning, he locked the document in a fireproof metal box he had kept since his father died, placing it gently, almost reverently, because this wasn't just evidence. It was the heart of his land, the final weapon in his quiet war. And as he closed the lid with a soft click, Daniel looked around the small cabin, the empty walls, the lonely bed, the quiet air, and whispered with steady calm, "They don't know what's coming," and the air felt charged, almost electric, as if the universe itself leaned in to listen. He knew now that he had the truth, but he also knew that truth needed timing, and timing was everything. So he didn't rush, didn't run straight to the HOA, didn't scream in the streets. Instead he smiled quietly, a rare, soft smile that held strength instead of sadness, because now he controlled the game, not them, and each day that passed brought him closer to the moment he would walk into their celebration, into their pride-filled event, into their stage of victory, and take everything back. In a single breath, Daniel Reed had found the paper they forgot, but it wasn't just a forgotten document. It was destiny hidden in ink, waiting for the right moment to break their hearts. Patricia Whitmore walked through the half-finished streets of Grand Oaks like a queen inspecting her kingdom, her heels clicking sharply on the new pavement, her eyes scanning every corner with cold confidence. She loved the power that came with her title, loved the way people moved out of her path, loved the way builders rushed to fix anything she pointed at, and she carried herself as if the sun rose only because she allowed it. And every time she passed the giant stone gate at the entrance with its shining letters, Grand Oaks Luxury Community, she smiled the smile of a woman who believed she had conquered everything, including Daniel's land, including Daniel himself, and she adored the story she repeated to anyone who asked, the story where she saved the neighborhood by removing an old broken-down farm that was dragging the area down. She told it with pride, with drama, with disgust, never imagining that the land she mocked was the same land preparing to destroy her carefully built empire. Daniel watched her sometimes from the far hill at sunset, the glow of the construction lights making her shadow long and sharp, and every time he saw her laughing loudly with her board members, waving her hands dramatically, pointing at houses like she was arranging pieces on a chessboard. He felt the same quiet fire rise inside him, not anger that burned wild but anger that burned steady, controlled, cold, the kind of anger that waits, and he let it stay in his chest, let it warm his determination, let it shape his silence into something stronger than her pride. He didn't look at her with rage, He looked at her like a man looking at a door he already had the key for, a door he would open when it suited him. Inside the Grand Oaks office, Patricia sat behind a glossy wooden desk imported from another state, her fingers tapping on her laptop, her jewelry sparkling under the warm yellow lights, her hair perfectly styled. She wasn't just a leader. She was a showpiece. Someone who wanted admiration. Someone who wanted power displayed around her like expensive perfume. And as she reviewed documents for the grand opening celebration, she felt nothing but triumph. The land was hers now. The homes were nearly completed. Buyers were excited. Investors were impressed. Everything was falling exactly the way she wanted. And her voice rang loud as she spoke to her board members. This community will be the crown jewel of our state. We removed the garbage that was blocking our progress, and look at what we built. And her board laughed, agreeing with every cruel word, some making comments about Daniel, calling him that stubborn old farmer, that useless man living in the past. And Patricia smirked, enjoying every insult as if it was applause. Daniel didn't know about every word spoken inside those walls, but he didn't need to. He could feel the arrogance from afar, feel the disrespect carried in the air like a bad smell, and yet he remained silent, because silence was his shield, his weapon, his strategy, and every night he whispered the same thing. Let her enjoy it. Let her think she won. Let her celebrate on land that never belonged to her. And the wind always took his words gently, like a promise carried to the soil. One afternoon, as Patricia supervised workers placing decorative lanterns along the sidewalks, she noticed a group of residents approaching, well-dressed couples looking around with excitement, and she flashed her brightest smile, the kind she practiced in the mirror, welcoming them with open arms. Welcome to Grand Oaks, the most exclusive neighborhood in our region. And she walked them through the houses, explaining every detail, the marble countertops, the imported tiles, the energy, efficient windows, and the buyers nodded eagerly, impressed by the luxury, unaware that the ground beneath their feet had a hidden heartbeat. A heartbeat tied to Daniel's family. A heartbeat the HOA tried to silence but couldn't. One of the buyers casually asked, "Who owned this land before?" And Patricia's smile stiffened for half a second before she brushed the question away with practiced ease. Some old farmer who didn't maintain anything properly. He was more like a squatter, really. She lied smoothly, waving her hand dismissively. We improved the land, made it useful, made it beautiful. And as she said that, something in the air shifted slightly, a strange uneasiness that even she felt for a moment. Like the land itself didn't like her words, but she ignored it, because Patricia only listened to praise, never warnings. That evening she sat in her glass-walled office, sipping expensive tea, reviewing plans for the grand celebration, fireworks, ribbon-cutting, media coverage, a speech she had already prepared where she would proudly announce herself as the visionary behind Grand Oaks, the woman who transformed wasteland into a paradise. And she practiced it out loud, smiling at her reflection in the window, enjoying the sound of her own power. But behind that glass, far in the distance, Daniel stood at the hill, watching her rehearsing victory on land she stole. And he whispered softly, "Practice your smile, Patricia. You will need it when you try to hide your fear." Daniel knew what she didn't. That the paper sitting inside his fireproof box at the cabin was a weapon sharper than any blade. A weapon she couldn't defend against, because arrogance blinds people, and Patricia was completely blind, blind to her mistakes, blind to her future downfall, blind to the truth that was slowly circling her like a silent storm. And Daniel sat on a fallen tree trunk near the hill, watching the lights glow from her office, feeling a deep sadness at how little she understood, because if she had shown even a little respect, even a little humanity, maybe things would have been different, but she didn't. She built her kingdom on stolen memories, stolen sweat, stolen history, and now she would pay for every inch she took. As the night grew darker, Patricia left her office laughing with board members, bragging about the attendance they expected for the grand opening, promising them that this event would make the HOA famous across the region. And they all walked out with confidence glowing in their eyes, completely unaware that the man they believed was broken, the man they dismissed as a nothing, was the same man quietly walking back to his cabin with a locked box under his arm, a box containing the truth that would destroy them in front of the whole town. Inside the cabin, Daniel placed the box on the table, lit a candle, and stared at it with calm eyes. Eyes that held no fear now, only purpose, only determination, and he whispered softly into the quiet room. "Tomorrow or the next day, your time will come, Patricia." And as the flame flickered gently, the shadows on the walls seemed to bow in agreement, because the land remembered, the soil remembered, the trees remembered, and Daniel felt his ancestors standing behind him like silent guardians, giving him strength. The HOA had their queen, their powerful Karen with her high heels and sharp tongue, but Daniel had something stronger. Truth, patience, and the land's loyalty, and the land never forgets who it belongs to. The night before the celebration arrived like a heavy storm hiding behind a calm sky. The world outside quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a truth finally breaks free, and inside his small cabin, Daniel sat at the wooden table with only a candle burning beside him. Its warm light trembling gently across the room, casting long shadows that moved like memories reaching out from the past, and he sat there staring at the fireproof box that held the old land agreement, the agreement that held his family's voice, his grandfather's promise, his father's sweat, his mother's dreams, and the weight of that box felt heavier than stone, like it carried every tear he never cried, every word he never said, every piece of grief he buried deep inside when the HOA took everything from him. He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing the cold metal surface, and something inside him tightened, not in fear but in emotion. A deep, aching wave that reminded him of everything he lost, everything they stole. And for a long moment he didn't move, didn't breathe, just let himself feel the pain that he had kept silent for so many weeks. Pain he never allowed to spill out in front of anyone, because Daniel wasn't the kind of man who broke easily. He was the kind who held his hurt, quietly carrying it alone like a weight on his back. And tonight that weight felt heavier because tomorrow he would face the people who laughed at his suffering, the people who tore down his barn, the people who walked through his memories as if stepping on dust. He closed his eyes and saw the porch where his mother sat every evening, humming softly as she knitted blankets for winter. He saw his father sharpening tools in the fading sunset, teaching him how to hold a hammer, how to fix a fence, how to respect the land because the land always gave back to those who cared for it. And he saw himself as a boy running barefoot through the tall wheat, his laughter blending with the wind, the same wind that now whispered outside his cabin like an old friend, waiting patiently for him to stand again. And a tear slid down his cheek, silent, warm, falling on the back of his hand. But Daniel didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, because this night wasn't about hiding emotion. It was about remembering why he was fighting at all. He opened the metal box slowly, the hinges creaking softly in the quiet room, and when he lifted the old handwritten agreement, the paper felt fragile but strong, like it had waited all these years to be held again. And Daniel traced his grandfather's signature with trembling fingers, whispering softly, "You protected it even after you were gone." And the words broke something inside him, something that had been locked away for too long. A deep cry he kept buried in silence, and he bowed his head, shoulders shaking as quiet sobs escaped his chest, the candlelight shimmering through tears that reflected years of pain, years of struggle, years of holding on to memories no one else cared about. But even through his tears, there was strength in him, a strength that came from the land itself, from the generations who lived on it, worked on it, bled on it. And when Daniel wiped his eyes and lifted his head again, his face carried a different look, not broken, not weak, but determined, steady, unshaken, because tonight wasn't about grief anymore. Tonight was about preparation. Tonight was about standing for every reed who came before him, and for every inch of soil they loved. He spread the documents across the table. Property maps, boundary records, tax receipts, old photographs, newspaper clippings, and of course, the land agreement that would crush the HOA's lies like dry leaves under a boot. And as he arranged everything with careful hands, the room filled with the quiet sound of papers sliding, each one carrying a story the HOA never bothered to learn, each one a reminder that they didn't destroy a man, they awakened a legacy. He rehearsed everything in his mind. How he would walk into the celebration with calm steps, how he would let Patricia smile and brag in front of the crowd, how he would wait for the exact moment to reveal the truth, how he would hand the document to the judge, how the judge's voice would echo through the crowd as he read the agreement aloud, and how Patricia's confident face would turn pale, her smile cracking, her arrogance collapsing like rotten wood. And Daniel breathed deeply, imagining it all, feeling the quiet satisfaction of justice building inside him like a rising tide. He knew tomorrow wouldn't be easy. He knew people would stare, people would whisper, some would be angry, some confused, some afraid, because his truth would shake the entire neighborhood, would make homeowners realize the ground beneath them was stolen, and Daniel didn't want to hurt them. He wasn't a man who took joy in others' suffering. His fight was not against the residents. His fight was against the HO, against Patricia, against the lies that tore his home apart. And he whispered to the papers in front of him, "I don't want your homes. I just want what's mine." And the room felt warmer, as if the land itself agreed with him. As midnight approached, Daniel walked outside the cabin, the cold wind brushing gently against his face, the sky full of stars, bright and watching, and he stood there with his arms crossed, staring at the distant glow of Grand Oaks, the lights shining arrogantly against the dark sky, and he whispered softly, "Enjoy your night, Patricia, tomorrow everything changes." And the wind answered with a long, low sigh like an ancient voice saying, "It's time." He walked back inside, locked the documents safely inside the box, placed it gently under his arm, and sat on the bed, his heart heavy but strong, his mind calm but sharper than ever. Tomorrow he wouldn't walk into that celebration as a broken man. He wouldn't walk there as someone begging for justice. He would walk in as the rightful owner of the land, the guardian of generations, the man who carried truth in his hands while the HOA carried lies in theirs. And the difference between truth and lies was simple. Truth always wins, sometimes late, but always. As he lay down, the cabin darkening slowly, Daniel whispered one final promise to himself, to his family, to the land. "Tomorrow, I take everything back." And his eyes closed gently, not in fear but in peace, because he knew that the sun rising in the morning would not just mark a new day. It would mark the day the HOA's pride finally fell. Morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something big to happen. And Daniel woke before the first bird sang, sitting on the edge of his bed with the fireproof box resting safely beside him, the weight of it grounding him, reminding him who he was, reminding him what today meant, because this wasn't just a day of celebration for the HO. It was the day their lives would finally face the truth, the day the land would speak through the ink his grandfather left behind, the day Daniel Reed would walk back onto his stolen soil, not as a broken man but as the rightful owner reclaiming what was torn from him. He stood slowly, washed his face with cold water, and took a long breath that filled him with calm strength, the kind that comes from knowing justice is finally at the door. He put on his old jacket, the same jacket his father wore during harvest seasons, the same jacket that still carried the faint smell of soil and sweat and memory, and when Daniel placed the box under his arm, he felt older and younger at the same time, older because of everything he endured, younger because hope had returned to his chest like a heartbeat that refused to die. The road to Grand Oaks felt different today, every step steady, every breath controlled, the winter air sharp but energizing, and as he walked, he could hear faint music rising in the distance, laughter, excited chatter, the sounds of a neighborhood ready to celebrate itself, ready to cheer for Patricia, ready to admire the new homes, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was not theirs to celebrate, unaware that their joy rested on a foundation of stolen memories, unaware that Daniel's quiet footsteps carried the truth that would shake their celebration to its core. When he reached the hill overlooking the neighborhood, he paused for a moment, looking down at the scene below. A large decorated stage, golden balloons tied to every pole, a long red ribbon stretched across the entrance, children running with cupcakes, homeowners dressed in bright clothes, music echoing through the streets like a festival. And there, in the center of it all, stood Patricia Whitmore, wearing a shiny navy blue suit, her hair perfect, her smile wide and proud as she greeted guests with confidence glowing in her every movement. She looked like a woman who believed nothing could touch her, nothing could challenge her, nothing could break her. And Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly, not in hatred but in understanding, because arrogance like hers always falls the hardest. He walked down the hill slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, the box held firmly under his arm, and as he approached the gate of the neighborhood, People turned their heads slightly, some recognizing him, whispering quietly, confusion in their eyes, guilt in some, discomfort in others, because even though they didn't know the whole story, they had heard enough rumors to know who he was, the man who once lived on this land, the man whose home was torn down to build their dream houses. And a few lowered their eyes, unable to meet his steady gaze. But Daniel kept walking, calm, silent, unshaken. Patricia spotted him from the stage mid-sentence, her confident smile freezing for a split second, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she forced her fake cheerful tone back into place. "Oh, Daniel," she said loudly, pretending her voice didn't tremble. "I didn't expect to see you here." And her board members exchanged nervous glances, because his presence was a shadow they didn't want standing in their light, a reminder of something they tried to bury. But Daniel didn't answer her yet. He stepped forward and instead of looking at her, he looked at the judge walking toward the stage, the same judge he had quietly met in secret, the same judge who had read the Reed family agreement in disbelief, the same judge who respected history, law, and justice, and when their eyes met, the judge gave him a small nod, a nod that carried respect, a nod that carried promise. Patricia looked between them, confusion flickering through her expression before annoyance replaced it. She lifted her chin, raising her microphone as she prepared to continue her speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the grand opening of Grand Oaks, the most prestigious." But she didn't finish. The judge lifted his hand gently, signaling her to stop, and his voice, calm but firm, echoed through the speakers. "Before the celebration continues, we need to address something important." The music stopped. The laughter died. Every head turned. Patricia's smile faltered, the color draining slightly from her face as she forced out a shaky laugh. "Judge, I'm sure this can wait until after." "No," he said simply, "it cannot." And then the judge stepped aside and gestured toward Daniel, who stepped onto the stage with slow, steady steps, the box still under his arm, the crowd silent, the air thick with tension, and Patricia's eyes widened, her confident posture stiffening, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. Daniel didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. He simply opened the box quietly, removing the old land agreement with careful hands, holding it up for the judge, the paper catching the sunlight in a way that made it look almost sacred, and the crowd leaned forward as the judge unfolded it, clearing his throat before reading aloud. His voice was steady, loud, and every word echoed like thunder rolling across the ground. "This document, signed in 1961 by the original owner, Mr. Henry Reed, states that Reed family land cannot be sold, transferred, or claimed by any outside party unless personally approved and signed by a living Reed family member." The moment the judge finished reading the last line of the old agreement, the entire neighborhood fell into a heavy silence, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and steals the breath from the air. And for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke, no one even blinked. They just stared at Daniel standing calmly on the stage, holding the truth in his hands, the truth that had the power to turn their dream homes into a nightmare. And Patricia Whitmore stood frozen at the edge of the platform, her perfect smile shattered, her makeup cracking as sweat gathered along her hairline. Her fingers trembling around the microphone she no longer had the strength to lift, because for the first time in her life, she was not the one in control. For the first time her words had no power. For the first time she felt the cold edge of fear carving through her confidence. The crowd whispered softly at first, scattered voices rising like small waves of confusion. "Is this real? She stole the land? What happens to our homes? We trusted her. How could she do this?" And those whispers quickly grew sharper, louder, more emotional, because people weren't just shocked. They were betrayed. They had spent their savings, their lives, their hopes building homes on land that wasn't legally theirs, and the more they realized it, the more they turned their eyes toward Patricia, eyes filled with anger, disappointment, and heartbreak. Daniel watched them quietly, his heart heavy but steady. He had never wanted to hurt the residents. They were innocent people who bought homes without knowing the truth. They were victims just like him. And when he looked at them, he didn't see enemies. He didn't see strangers living on his land. He saw families who trusted the wrong people. Families who were now standing on shaking ground because of Patricia's lies, and he felt the weight of their fear pressing against his chest. But he also knew this moment had to happen. The truth had to rise even if it broke hearts. Because broken hearts could heal with honesty, but lies only spread poison. Patricia suddenly stepped forward, her voice cracking as she tried to reclaim control. This is a misunderstanding," she stuttered, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the microphone. "He's lying. This paper is old, meaningless. He is doing this out of bitterness." But the judge cut her off sharply, his voice firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, the document has been verified by the court." And he held up a second sheet, stamped with a seal, official and undeniable. "This is legally binding." Patricia's face twisted, her confidence shattering like glass hitting concrete, and she turned toward Daniel with desperation in her eyes. "You can't do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "You can't take everything away from us. These are people's homes." Daniel looked at her with calm eyes, not cold, not cruel, just steady. As steady as the land underneath them. And his voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the entire crowd instantly. "I didn't take anything from them," he said softly. "You did." The words struck Patricia like a physical blow, her knees buckling slightly, and she reached for the edge of the table to steady herself, her breath coming out in short, panicked gasps, because deep inside she knew he was right. She knew every lie she told, every shortcut she took, every document she hid, every rule she bent, and now all of it stood in front of her with no place left to hide. A man from the front row stepped forward, his voice shaking with anger. "We trusted you, Patricia," he said, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You told us this land was clear, safe, legal. My wife and I put everything we had into this house." Another woman grabbed her husband's arm, tears streaming down her face. "Our children finally had a backyard to play in, and now we don't even know if we have a home," she cried, turning toward Daniel. "What will happen to us?" Daniel stepped forward gently, and the entire crowd leaned toward him, searching his face for answers, for hope, for anything that wasn't fear, and he spoke softly. "I am not here to take your homes. I am here to take back the truth," and his voice trembled with emotion. "Your fight is not with me. Your fight is with the people who lied to you." The crowd listened in complete silence, their anger shifting, their confusion softening, because for the first time since the announcement, someone was speaking with honesty, someone who wasn't trying to escape blame or twist words, someone who carried pain but not cruelty. Daniel continued, his voice stronger now. "This land was my family's legacy, and the HOS stole it from me the same way they misled all of you." He paused, letting the truth sink in. "I lost my home, my fields, my memories, but I don't want anyone else to lose theirs because of what they did." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, people wiping tears, people nodding slowly, people realizing Daniel wasn't against them. He never was. But Patricia wasn't ready to accept defeat. Her pride too big, her ego too loud, and she stepped closer to Daniel, her voice breaking as she screamed, "You're doing this because you hate me." Daniel looked at her calmly, the wind lifting his hair as he replied, "I don't hate you, Patricia. I pity you." And the words echoed like a quiet knife, sharp, soft, impossible to ignore. "Because you built your power on lies, and lies always fall." Patricia's mouth opened but no sound came out, her eyes darting left and right as if searching for someone to protect her, searching for someone to confirm her innocence. But all she found were angry stares, disappointed faces, and the hard truth reflected in every eye around her. She stepped backwards, shaking her head slowly in disbelief, her voice a broken whisper. "No, no. This can't be happening. I worked so hard for this. I deserve this." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, his voice softening with painful honesty. "Hard work is not the same as stealing, Patricia," he whispered. "You didn't build this. You took it." And with those words, her final wall of pride collapsed. Patricia sank onto the nearest chair, her hands covering her face as she cried silently, not out of guilt but out of fear of losing everything she thought she owned, everything she bragged about, everything she built on top of someone else's pain. Meanwhile, the judge stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "There will be legal steps," he assured them. "No one will be thrown out of their homes tonight. Nothing will happen without court review." But the HOA is under investigation effective immediately. Gasps filled the air again. But this time there was relief mixed with the shock. Families clung to each other, some crying, some breathing easier. And Daniel stood silently in the middle of the stage, the wind brushing past him like an old friend whispering, "It's almost done." Patricia looked up one last time, her eyes red, her voice barely a breath. "You ruined everything?" Daniel looked at her with a quiet sadness. Not gloating, not proud, simply honest. "No," he said softly. "You ruined it the moment you touched land that didn't belong to you." And with that, the truth stood taller than any house in the neighborhood. It broke their hearts. But it also set everything right. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers exchanged uneasy looks. Homeowners whispered, "What does that mean? Is this real? Are our houses illegal?" Patricia's face drained white, her lips trembling as she whispered, "No, no, that can't be. This must be fake." But the judge continued reading, ignoring her panic. "The document is verified, legal, binding, and still active, which means all current construction, sales, and land claims made by the HOA are invalid." Daniel stood there silently, watching Patricia's confidence crumble, her eyes shaking, her hands trembling as she clutched the microphone, her voice breaking when she tried to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, Daniel lifted his eyes, looking at the crowd, his voice calm, soft, but carrying the weight of everything he lost. "You took my home, my fields, my memories, without my permission, without a right, without a thought, but you never had the authority to take any of it." Patricia stumbled back, her knees shaking, her pride collapsing like a fragile wall hit by a storm. And the entire neighborhood stared at her not with admiration anymore, but with shock, anger, betrayal, and fear. Daniel didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't enjoy her downfall. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. This land never belonged to the HO. It always belonged to the Reed family. And today, the land finally got its voice back. The celebration was no longer a celebration. It was the beginning of the end.